First, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having offices close to public transportation. As you know, I'm something of a transit fanatic, and in any event, I hate driving around this city when it's so much more pleasant to do this. So this was a very quick ride, and I'm no longer a visiting professor at Northeastern. I've been there for 23 years, and now they call me a distinguished professor. But my day job is full-time teaching at Northeastern all the time, except for 3 months during the winter when Kitty and I, difficult though it is, drag ourselves out of New England, and I teach at UCLA in Los Angeles. It's a terrible burden, but somebody's got to do it. And we've been doing that. We'll be going out for our 19th winter. Actually, we've got an excuse. We have 3 kids and a son who lives in Newton with his family, and 2 daughters, one in Denver, one in San Francisco. They each have 2 kids, so it gives us a chance to spend more time with them. And now, as the grandkids grow, the big deal is to leave their parents at home and come and spend a kind of winter weekend with us in Los Angeles, which is great fun. Sadly, however, we had tragedy in our family. Kitty and I and our kids and grandkids went to Greece to celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary. And while they had learned that our daughter-in-law, our son John's wife's sister, was killed in an automobile accident with her 4 kids, all of whom survived. She had temporarily taken off her seatbelt to reach back and get a camera, at which point a tire blew and she was killed. Some of you may recall I was responsible for one of the first mandatory seatbelt laws in the nation. Didn't go over swimmingly with some of my constituents. Federal government had to come in and say, you're not going to get your highway money if you don't pass it. But that tragedy is just another reminder, folks, of the fact that we got to put those things on and keep them on. I mean, it's just, you know, she was a wonderful woman, married, but a second time to a nice guy, but she was the principal support of her kids. And as a result of all of this, our son and daughter-in-law have been given custody of the kids. So we don't have 3 grandkids in Newton, we got 7, because Claudia had 4 kids. And I can't say enough for the way Newton has responded to these children. I mean, it's been terrific. But these days we don't have 8 grandkids, we got 12, I guess. Anyway, as I was saying to some of you informally when we were having a sandwich, I have serious, grave doubts about American national security policy, in part because I think the world has changed dramatically. And because life and history teach us that the kind of interventionism which we've been engaged in pretty actively under administrations of both parties since World War II, not only isn't working, it's almost irrelevant to the kind of threat that we face. And there is a threat that we do face, and it's called international terrorism, as all of us know. But with some exceptions, there is a strong international consensus that that terrorism is unacceptable. And that's true whether you're talking to the Russians, the Chinese, the Brits, the French, the Brazilians, the Turks, or anyone else. And forms a basis, in my judgment, for building a new world order. I can use the phrase of the guy that defeated me for the presidency, but who in this area I think made a lot of sense. Now, what does a new world order mean in this context? It means a growing body of international law, sorry, but I'm a lawyer, used to be, which governs the conduct of nations with institutions led by the United Nations with all of its imperfections that seek to enforce that body of international law in a way that helps to resolve differences without armed conflict. And I'm not being a romantic when I say this, because this is the most peaceful world I and my dear wife have ever lived in, if you can believe this. And I've been around for 80 years, and she's going to be celebrating her 77th birthday in December. The best-looking Medicare recipient in America, without a doubt. Everybody says to me, Kitty looks so beautiful. I said, what, she's 70? She's 77. Anyway. Now, why has that happened? Well, I suppose the destructive force of the kind of weapons that we've developed has kind of driven some sense into people's heads about the use of military force. Secondly, although we still have a long way to go, there have been remarkable advances in the elimination of poverty, in international public health, and all kinds of things, which I'm not even sure we're as aware of as we should be, and frankly don't give ourselves enough credit. I had a scholarship to study at the University of San Marcos in Lima, Peru, in 1954, during the summer after my junior year at Swarthmore College. It was kind of a crazy deal because I didn't speak a word of Spanish. And I really wanted to go to Greece and study Greek politics at the time, which were kind of interesting in the post-World War II period. But I didn't get the grant I was looking for the trip to Greece. And I'd never been to Greece at that time, even though I grew up bilingual and all that kind of stuff. And my faculty advisor was pretty upset as well, but I went in to see him, and there was a guy named Jerry Mangone. And I said, so what do I do now? It's May, I can always go back home and work construction, but I'd really like to do something interesting. He said, well, I'm on the selection committee for a new bunch of scholarships that have just been endowed by a wealthy Swarthmore alumnus who made his money in Latin America and wants to interest young people in Latin America. Because in those days, folks, this was 54, it was all about Europe. Marshall Plan, you know, the European coal and steel community, all of this kind of stuff. And Latin America was kind of down there. There were 3 functioning democracies in all of Latin America. Most of them were military dictators or military dictatorships, and we were supporting all of them because they were anti-communist. As a matter of fact, Fred Harris, you remember, was the rather interesting United States Senator from Oklahoma, used to say in those days that if you could afford a uniform and a pair of sunglasses and said you were an anti-communist, we'd support you. So I'm down in Peru at the time. That was the year, by the way, that we overthrew the democratically elected government of Guatemala. In 1954, 1 out of every 2 Peruvian babies never reached its first birthday. Think about it. The infant mortality rate in Peru was 50%. Today, infant mortality in Peru is roughly at the international average. I mean, this has been remarkable gains. Don't get me wrong, we still have nations and peoples and communities that have a long way to go to achieve the kind of level of economic sustenance and success that we'd like to have for everybody. But there's just been, these have been dramatic changes. Kitty and I were in Vietnam for a couple of weeks in April, after I finished up at UCLA for the winter. Not only are the Vietnamese the most forgiving people I think I've ever met. I mean, if they had done to us what we did to them, I don't think we'd be so forgiving. But while it's still a country that's developing, I mean, the standard of living in Vietnam, the level of economic success, they're the second biggest rice exporter in the world. Advances in public health, advances in education are remarkable. And this under an interesting one-party communist government, which I think before long is going to become something quite different. So that's the world that we face today. And I think the United States is still dealing with it with a kind of Cold War warp to our policy. 837 American bases in 150 countries, spending billions on weapons of war that are utterly irrelevant to the terrorist threat, which really has nothing to do with supercarriers or any of this kind of stuff. A repositioning of a good deal of American military might to the Pacific. 2,500 Marines are supposed to go to Australia, for reasons I'm not sure I understand, because the Asia that we spent 2 weeks in is actually remarkably peaceful. Now, there are some disputes. There are about a half a dozen countries over there that are arguing over some worthless islands. But even here, it seems to me, the role of the United States ought to be to say to the Japanese, the Chinese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, and so forth, hey, we got something called the International Court of Justice. It's the world court. That's what they do. They resolve differences between countries around these kinds of issues. That's where you ought to go. We're not saying that. And I think the United States ought to be the nation that says those kinds of things and tries to resolve these kinds of disputes using existing international institutions. Now, it is true that when the International Court of Justice said that we were violating international law when we were trying to overthrow the Sandinista government, we got mad and refused to accept their decision. But they were right and we were wrong. And in point of fact, as any of you know anything about Latin America, we have an organization down there called the Organization of American States. We signed and ratified the treaty that created it in 1947 in Rio de Janeiro. It has a charter. The charter says no member state shall intervene directly or indirectly in the affairs of any other member state. And of course, we were doing that in Nicaragua. Now, unbeknownst to us, apparently, the Sandinistas had not only infiltrated our CIA agent, the CIA office in Managua, 3 of the top Contra military commanders were Sandinista agents, and none of them knew the other 2 were. No surprise that the Contras never won a single military engagement in that ridiculous conflict, which ended with the Iran-Contra scandal and all that stuff. Now, why am I optimistic about the future? And I am. Now, it's true, can't be in politics and be a pessimist. I mean, if you don't think that good people working together can make a difference, then you're in the wrong business. But I'm not a cockeyed optimist. But I'm seeing things now which are very encouraging. I think the focus on chemicals as opposed to military intervention in Syria made a lot of sense. And apparently won unanimous support from the Security Council. Surprise, surprise. Thanks to the Iranian people, even though our overthrow of the Mossadegh government in '53 was about as dumb a decision as we've ever made, and is the cause of a great deal of this stuff, and I don't know how many of you old enough to remember that? A few of us.
I know about it.
What was that all about? Any of you know?
Prime Minister, they had elections with the Communist Party.
No, he wasn't a communist at all. In fact, he was an anti-communist. He was in the... Yeah. At that time, the Iranian oil industry was majority owned by the British government. It was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The Prime Minister of the UK at the time was Winston Churchill. He was back. Now, a great man in many ways, but an imperialist to his core. And he called his friend Harry Truman. He said, Harry, you got to help me get rid of this guy Mossadegh. He wants to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. Truman, to his credit, said, under no circumstances will we do that. If they want to nationalize their oil industry, as long as they're willing to pay a fair value, they have a right to do that. Eisenhower came in, brought in John Foster Dulles with him, whose brother Alan was the head of the CIA, and sure enough, the CIA then proceeded to overthrow Mossadegh, put him under house arrest for the rest of his life, and bring the Shah, who was a young guy cowering in some hotel in Rome, back and put him on the throne, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that's kind of the backdrop for this, folks. And as I said to some of you informally earlier, it's obvious to me that American intervention, or the intervention of us and a few of our pals, not only isn't working, we can't pay for it. I mean, I have a lot of respect for John McCain in many ways, and I think he's been one of the more responsible Republicans in the course of this craziness that's going on in Washington right now. But every time McCain and Graham want to intervene someplace, I have one question for them. What taxes are you going to raise to pay for this? Or are you going to simply put this on the tab again? And in any event, and I said this to some of you earlier, we're closer today to that point in world history for the first time where the use of force to settle disputes between and among countries is rapidly being ruled out as an acceptable part of what this world is all about. I mean, think about it. And with some good hard work, I don't know how you resolve the Syrian thing now, except to make sure that we get rid of the chemicals. It's pretty obvious, particularly since Kerry's visit to Beijing, that the Chinese essentially are squashing this kid in Seoul, in Panmunjom. I'm sorry, I was in Pyongyang. I was 7 miles from Panmunjom, so I kind of remember those days. To the point where they're now threatening to refuse to supply North Korea with some of the stuff they need for some of this military stuff. And in my view, pretty good evidence that the Chinese are kind of fed up with this. And at some point, I hope in the not too distant future, we'll end this crazy policy toward Cuba, which has been going on for 50 years, and which makes no sense at all, particularly at a time when clearly Cuba now wants something different. Cuban people want something different. And I think it's time we sat down and settled this foolishness and lifted the embargo and gave these folks a chance to not only begin to experience democratic pluralism, but to achieve a standard of living which they're perfectly capable of achieving with a freer economy and with plenty of economic activity between us and Cuba. All of which leads to the tantalizing prospect that within the next, year or two, notwithstanding the fact that the Middle East will continue to be a place of controversy and upheaval, because, when two guys, one of Britain, one of the French, decided to draw the map of the Middle East after World War I, it had little or nothing to do with ethnicity, with religion, with anything. And so there was a very interesting piece in the Sunday Times by an expert, Robin Wright, on the Middle East that talked about the likely redrawing of the map of the Middle East. Take a look at it. Very interesting. Very interesting. But there's no reason that can't happen without constant intervention by us and others, and maybe with some international supervision. Who knows? Now, in the meantime, if I'm half right about this, there's no reason why the United States couldn't dramatically cut its expenditures for the military wisely, without in any way jeopardizing our national security, and begin to do some investing in this country's future, especially our public infrastructure, which is in woeful shape, folks. And I won't spend too much time on that. Have me back and I'll talk to you about high-speed rail. But, and I am slightly obsessive on the subject, but collapsing bridges in the United States of America. I mean, what is that all about? Trains that, with one exception, are still putzing along at 80 miles an hour, while the rest of the world is just going right by us. Transit systems which are in lousy shape, struggling to get somewhat better, while cities all over the world are investing billions in terrific transit systems, which you and I ride when we go to these countries and go to these capitals. I mean, even here, where we spent a lot of time, as you know, when I was governor, modernizing the T and expanding it and deciding we didn't need more highways, what we needed was better transit. We still have a gap of a mile between North and South Station, and we can't close it. I mean, this is absurd. I mean, it would be like having the Red Line stop at South Station and resume at Kendall. Connecting those two stations, which, by the way, can be done for relatively little, I mean, compared to these estimates we're getting from the T, about $8 billion, which are ludicrous. I mean, the average cost of underground railroad tunnels in the world is about $900 million a mile. The Brits, for example, are building the so-called Crossrail project, 20 miles, 13 miles underground, $900 million a mile, and nobody's going to tell me that it costs less to tunnel under London than it does under Boston. I said to somebody about a year ago, they'll probably find Roman ruins there. They did a month ago. I don't know how many of you saw this. They also found Richard III, or his bones. And by the way, what's happening in London under a conservative government, which, by the way, now wants to get on to Crossrail 2, another major underground tunnel, is happening in capitals all over the world. High-speed rail in China, folks, they're going right by us. They're going right by us. It's having an enormous impact for the better on their economy. But as long as we keep spending billions on a military that we really don't need and is utterly irrelevant to the threat that we do face, we're not going to be able to invest in this kind of thing. And with all due respect to these Tea Party people and so on, I think most Americans believe that there's one role government has to play. It's to invest in public infrastructure. I mean, who else is going to do it? And there's no Republican way or Democratic way to build high-speed rail, folks. I mean, there's the right way and the wrong way. And I'd like to see us focusing on those kinds of domestic economy building investments, which incidentally would put a hell of a lot of unemployed Americans to work at the same time. Now, I don't know how you feel about all of this, but I think we're at a very important juncture in world history. And I think the United States can play a very special role in all of this. But we've got to learn from our experiences. And it seems to me that we have a wonderful opportunity here to provide leadership in a way that can create the kind of world that I'm talking about. And I hope we will do that. Anyway, what do you think of all of this? And feel free to fire away. Yeah.
Mr. Governor, you mentioned that you've been in politics for a long time and that you were certainly an optimist, otherwise you wouldn't be. If
Right.
you weren't a cockeyed optimist, that you were very practical. Politics is the art of the possible.
Right.
When we look at Washington, D.C. today, and we contrast that with your admittedly alluring vision of the future, I wonder, just like North Station and South Station, how you are ever going to connect that vision of a future in which the U.S. plays a very different role in international strategy from where we are today when it comes to things like the budget of the Pentagon or entitlements with which the Tea Party is implacably opposed. How do you
do this?
advise someone like Mr. Obama to turn the nation around?
Well, actions have political consequences in this political system of ours. I don't think this is a reason for being tough, although I commend him for being tough in this case, because I think using a simple continuing resolution, or for that matter, the raising of the debt limit, which Republicans have voted for repeatedly over the course of the past many years, as have Democrats, by the way, as an excuse for trying to deal with a policy they don't like, which incidentally is designed to ensure uninsured Americans, 85% of whom are working or members of working families, something which I don't think the White House or the congressional Democrats have emphasized anywhere near as much. This is all about working Americans. But if you're on welfare in this country, you get Medicaid. These are working Americans, 100 million of them, with either no insurance or what we used to kid around and call buffalo policies. You all know what a buffalo policy is, right? No? It insures you, but only if you're hit by a buffalo on Main Street at noontime. Otherwise, no cover. It's lousy insurance. Middle-class Americans waking up and finding that their insurance policies don't cover pregnancy. It's happening all the time, folks. High deductibles, all this kind of stuff. But somebody's going to pay for this slowdown. Now, I think that somebody is going to be the Republican Party, and sadly, probably the remaining moderate Republicans in the Congress who are in competitive districts, not gerrymandered districts, and could well lose their seats because of the Tea Party folks that they don't agree with. But you have to take a reasonably long view of this. I don't mean 20 years, but I mean, it can't be. People have said to me, have you ever seen it this bad? Well, I said, did you see the movie Lincoln? How about Vietnam? How about Joe McCarthy? I lived through all this stuff. This country was badly divided, angrily divided. So it's not as if we haven't seen this before, but I think there are going to be consequences. We'll see for whom and under what circumstances. But this kind of situation is not going to continue for any long period of time here, in my judgment. Somebody's going to pay for this. I think it's going to be the Republicans, sadly in a way, because I worked, folks, with some very good Republicans up the hill, lots of them. We shared a lot of the same common values, particularly on issues of civil liberties and civil rights. The Republicans were a lot stronger than the Democrats when I first went in the legislature. And on issues of integrity, tell you, the state government that I walked into in 1962 as a young legislator was one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt state governments in the country. We spent a lot of time trying to clean this up. I'm serious. People were being indicted every week around here. And it was a lot of good Republicans with whom us younger Democrats worked to pass the toughest conflict of interest law in the country and to do the stuff that, to a very great extent, cleaned up some of that stuff. Unfortunately, most of those folks that I work with are now either independents or Democrats. And they've kind of left the Republican Party, which I think is very sad, because the more polarized the system becomes, the less likely it is that you can deal with this. But even having said that, one of the things that I learned somewhat late in my career, in fact, I got thrown out of the governorship once for my lack of understanding of this, is that getting things done in the public sector is all about trying to achieve consensus, folks. How do you do that? You do it by bringing people together. People who may think they hate each other's guts. And one of the things that a president or a governor, or for that matter a mayor, can do is to ask people to be part of that process. And very few people refuse if they've been invited by the elected chief executive to do that. I've often said that once I figured this out, I never remember anybody saying, "Screw you, Governor, I don't choose to participate," even when I've asked that person to be part of a working group on some issue. I mean, most Americans want to solve problems. And my experience also tells me that if you can agree on what the problem is, you're halfway to the solution. Now, I don't want to be critical of the president because I like him, and furthermore, he won twice and I got beat, so I have a lot of respect for people who can win. And his communication skills are much better than mine. But given the fact that 93% of the American people, when polled, say that working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable health care, I wonder if he had pulled together a bipartisan working group and said, can we agree that working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable health care? And can we start from that point? I think, maybe wrong, but I think there might have been a greater chance for consensus here, since the Obamacare, you know, is the product of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, and was preceded by Romney Care, which, to the credit of Romney at the time, he got rolling, even though in the end he kind of disappeared on the thing. But without Romney's leadership in this case saying, hey, we're spending all this money on free care, why don't we take that money and insure uninsured people? We'd have never had the model which served as the basis for Obamacare. So, as I say, I think you have to take not a long view, but this can't be minute to minute, you know, 724 coverage stuff. I don't know about you guys. I can't stand watching television news these days. It just drives me nuts. So I read the Globe and I read the New York Times, and I think I'm reasonably well informed. And of course, I'm, you know, obviously teaching and doing lots of research and that kind of stuff. But I think over the next few years, we're going to see a lot of these issues resolved. And if, in point of fact, the Affordable Care Act is implemented, and I think it's going to be, and the American people begin to realize that their neighbors and friends are the folks that are benefiting from this, and these are working Americans. They're not loafing and they're not sitting around. I think the issue may resolve itself. Now, look, there are always going to be differences, folks, between those of us who believe that government should play a more active role in trying to solve social and economic problems, as opposed to those who prefer to have the private sector do that. But, and that's a perfectly legitimate argument to have. But I think there are going to be consequences to this thing, and 2 years from now, it may be very different. We will see. We will see. But that's the democratic process, for better or for worse.
Thank you, Mr. Governor.
Okay. Other thoughts, comments? Anybody? Yeah.
The 2,500 U.S. soldiers to Australia.
Marines.
Marines.
Yeah.
Oh, that's soldiers. All right.
Right.
I have, how should we say, a lot of in-laws in Australia.
Yeah.
And that is for domestic Australian consumption.
Right.
Believe me, they are paranoid. The Australians are paranoid about their neighbors.
About their neighbors.
Yeah.
You mean the Chinese, among others?
Anybody who's not white.
Yeah. Well,
That's,
there's been a history there.
oh yes, it's current history.
You know, Asians couldn't immigrate to Australia until what, the late 60s, early 70s, something like that?
Not the 70s.
Yeah. And look, we had something called the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1886 in the United States of America, you know.
That's probably what they got the idea.
Maybe so.
Yeah, that is Australian.
I understand, but look at the Chinese now. I mean, when we were in Vietnam, we met with the American ambassador. Good guy, professional, you know, foreign policy, foreign service professional, a guy named David Shear. So I said to him, we went in, hi, how are you? I said, tell me something, David. I said, what is this pivot to Asia all about? I mean, it looks to me like it's the Middle East that's kind of a place we got to pay some attention to here. What's this pivot to Asia? Well, we're not really adding anything, we're just moving stuff. I said, how do you think we'd feel if the Chinese moved a third of their Navy to about 50 miles off the west coast of the United States and announced that they were sending 3,000 Chinese Marines to Venezuela? What do you think? Everybody in Washington would be just fine with that, right? I mean, they just have, come on, folks, give me a break. And what I'm worried about here is that, first, that the U.S.-Chinese relationship is maybe one of the most important, maybe the most important relationship going forward we have internationally. And secondly, that we're kind of setting up another Cold War over there. Over what? I mean, the Chinese strike me as being really quite conservative internationally, in the sense that, I mean, they didn't invade Iraq, we did, right? Now, it doesn't mean that their neighbors are not concerned. I mean, the Vietnamese are very concerned about the Chinese because there's been a history of 1,000, 1,500 years of Chinese domination. But I don't think it's helped by the repositioning of our military might in the Pacific. Not to mention 11 cyber warfare teams, offensive teams that General Alexander now wants to organize somewhere, what, the Pentagon, whatever. At the same time, obviously, the Chinese are doing lots of cyber warfare of their own. And by the way, have now developed a pretty impressive collection of drones, which they're prepared to use if necessary, and which apparently the technology for which they got from breaking into what, the information systems of the drone manufacturers here, or maybe the Pentagon, or both. I'd like to see the United States call for an international conference on cyber warfare in which we begin to develop some rules about this whole thing before we go off and spend another $100 billion on cyber warfare. I mean, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we calling for this? I mean, I don't see any sense in our rushing headlong into this because we all know what's going to happen. So does everybody else. And I think maybe we can do that without having to read the emails of the president of Mexico and Brazil, don't you think? I mean, what is that all about? So, now, nothing against the Marines that are going to Australia. That's a great assignment.
I know.
I mean, if I were a GI again, you think I mean, they have great-looking women. They love Yanks. I mean, it's, if you ever been, some of you been to Australia? It's a lovely place. It's a lovely place.
Going up to King's Cross, right?
Yeah, it's fabulous. I mean, you know, great place to spend 12 or 16 months in uniform.
The bar's open at 8:30 in the morning.
Oh, God. And they're great people. But
Just comfortably racist.
it's the... Yeah. Yes.
However true.
I mean, the message to the Chinese is, we're going to surround you. For reasons I'm not sure I understand. And I don't think that advances the cause of the kind of world that I'm talking about, and I'm not being naive about the Chinese. I mean, you know, well, the Chinese are going to have the biggest economy in the world. Well, they've got 3 times the number of people we do. I mean, that doesn't surprise me. So what? Question is, what kind of member of the international community is China going to be? And how do we try to make it possible, necessary, whatever, for them to be a responsible and constructive member of the international community? And at least in the case of North Korea, my sense is that they are attempting to do that. They have supported sanctions on Iran, which, by the way, are hurting Iran badly and have a lot to do with Iran's latest response here. Believe me, the Iranian economy is in tatters as a result of the sanctions. And I think that's a good thing, because that's the way, short of military intervention, where you can enforce international law, in this case the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they have signed and then regularly violated. And it seems to me that policy is working. And if we can just keep Netanyahu under control here and make it happen, I'm optimistic about the possibility of a two-state solution. You know, needless to say, I know John Kerry very well. In fact, as I used to tell him, without me, Kerry, you'd be nothing. I mean, if I hadn't been elected, he wouldn't have been elected. I mean, nobody would have ever heard of Kerry, right? But he's made for this job, folks. I mean, this is John's job. And I think we're already seeing, not only that, there's an enormous respect for Kerry in international diplomatic circles. It's very interesting. In Vietnam, we had dinner with a former longtime foreign minister of Vietnam. I forget his name, but you'd recognize him in a second because he was in the press all the time during the war and after the war and so on. And I said, this was just when John had been appointed. And I said, what do you think of Kerry? He said, I like Kerry. I like him a lot. There's a lot of respect there. So I'm pleased that he's doing what he's doing, and I think he's making a major contribution here. But I just hope we can stay on this track and see if we can't increasingly think internationally when it comes to solving some of these problems. If we do, I think we're going to make great progress, folks. It's going to be a much better world. Who's next?
Say a couple more words about interventionism. I mean, I certainly agree with the fact that you can't take the anti-communist rhetoric and apply it to a country like Iraq or now in Syria, where you have hundreds of years old conflicts.
Yeah.
But at some point, thinking of the French in Mali recently, where they clearly had a serious problem. If they hadn't gone in, it would be worse now. You know, is there a role in the future for the U.S. to kind of be aware of that kind of situation?
Yeah,
I think there has to be.
but with strong support from the Security Council. Now, why did we end up with these folks in northern Mali? Because we intervened in Libya. Now, was anybody thinking about that? And by the way, having gotten the Russians and the Chinese to agree to a Security Council resolution supporting a no-fly zone over Libya, right? We then busted right through that resolution and started bombing them and doing all kinds of stuff in violation of the resolution. And Putin was mad as hell about this, you know, because he was very reluctant in the first place. He voted for this thing, and then we just kind of ignored the resolution and essentially just... Why do we do that? That's a good question. Why do we do that? Well, we want to get rid of Gaddafi, right? I guess. Now we got a situation in Libya which will end up with 3 Libyas or something at the rate we're going. And in the meantime, these folks decided to go back to northern Mali and create problems. Well, my view is that, I mean, given what we did in Libya, could we get Security Council support for some action in Mali? Maybe not, because the Russians and Chinese were pretty upset about the fact that we had essentially blown right through that resolution. But here again, I mean, it just seems to me that wherever possible, you want to try to deal with these things internationally. And as I say, I'm not being naive about this. And I think increasingly history supports the view that that's the most effective way for the United States to exercise leadership. Maybe wrong, but I'm not seeing much coming out of these unilateral or 3-nation interventions these days, and I think it's because they just don't work without strong international support. And sanctions if necessary, which is essentially what I think is having a huge impact on Iran. In addition to the votes of the Iranian people, let's not forget them, who even in a kind of interesting, limited democracy of sorts, clearly expressed their views in that election by electing the guy they did, as opposed to the others. Now he's got to deal with some very difficult domestic Iranian issues. And I don't know where Egypt is going, but, you know, wherever it's going doesn't look very democratic to me. So we'll see what happens. But again, look, the Middle East is going to be a region that's going to be in turmoil for some time. If we could possibly get a 2-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, I think that would have an enormous impact for the better. But Can we do that? I think we all know what the agreement's going to look like. Question is, can you get both sides to agree to it? And can they deal with their own domestic political issues if that kind of an agreement were to be
The Israeli
Where do we stand?
situation is very similar to the Irish situation up to 1921. And the main difference is an outside foreign power that was influenced by a voting bloc. In the case of Ireland, one man actually destroyed it. His name was Eamon de Valera, very interesting Spanish-American who became head of Ireland.
right? Spent a fair amount of time in Massachusetts, He's a very popular guy here.
Yeah, he was a piece of work.
He was.
The split has not happened as far as the Middle East is concerned.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Just got to keep working. Tenacity is the name of the game in this business.
Yes,
Politics is not for the faint-hearted, let me tell you.
that was for the stubborn.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Governor, what do you think about the situation in Egypt and especially maybe U.S. government's stand on the recent events in Egypt? Like there was an elected government, good or bad, but people voted for it,
Mm.
and it was overthrown by the army.
Mm.
But then U.S. government was reluctant to say that it was
Right.
a military coup.
And I think we're still giving them $1.3 billion in military aid, aren't we?
Yeah.
I don't have an easy answer to this, but I think we probably need something other than that. I mean, had we said, look, this is going to be very temporary. We expect free elections and so forth. But look, Egypt is going to be a troubled, confusing place for a long time. I mean, democracy is difficult. Democracy is difficult, folks. Look, it took us the bloodiest war in American history to decide what kind of a country we were going to be, at least geographically. And it took us another 100 years to decide that, first, that women could exercise the franchise, and secondly, the people of color could exercise the franchise. And it's a work in progress, and there are now people in the United States doing their best to disenfranchise a lot of people.
Back off.
With these foolish naturalization requirements when it comes to voting. In violation, apparent violation of federal law, by the way. So democracy is not easy. And that's particularly true when you've got a history of monarchy, of dictatorship, of this kind of stuff. And when in many of these cases, the United States has been quite supportive of these dictatorial regimes. This Latin American situation, believe me, back in the 50s and 60s was unbelievable. 70s. We didn't care whether they were Democratic or not. Were they with us? Were they against the Russians? So in Peru, for example, when I was there, you had a dictator named Manuel Odría. The leaders of the Aprista Party, which was the Democratic Left Party, led by a guy named Aya de la Torre, were all in the prison, the Alcatraz, out in the harbor. And anybody who had the slightest connection with them would disappear as well. And, we had that history in one Latin American nation after another, and we didn't do a hell of a lot about it. Because, they were with us against the Soviets and so forth. And it was no accident that a Castro finally appeared in Cuba. Why? Because we had supported Batista, and I remember stopping in Cuba on the way back from Peru. Those days was the pre-jet days, so you could stop on your ticket in various capitals. I think there were 3 stops from Peru to Miami. One in Colombia, one in Ecuador, and one in Panama, one in Cuba. And I was just in Cuba for the weekend, honest to God. It was, in fact, when Kitty and I, 3 years ago, decided to take 35 of our best friends to Cuba under the sponsorship of St. Sophia's Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Los Angeles, because, you still can't go to Cuba as an American citizen if you want to. You're going to be sponsored by somebody. And Father John Backus was the best Greek Orthodox priest I've ever known. He's a dear friend, and he's the dean of the cathedral there, so we went over with him and so forth. I was reminded of that first trip that I took in 1954, and wondering when maybe we can move beyond both of these kinds of periods and we were staying in the Hotel Nacional, which is about a 9-story hotel, which was the site in 1946 of an organized crime summit meeting of the leaders of organized crime in the United States, who were meeting in the Hotel Nacional. Why? Because if they had a meeting like that in the United States, the FBI would have arrested them all. And I remember saying to Kitty, we were on the 7th floor, I said, I wonder what gangster occupied our room. I mean, that's what was going on there. And, but I think, you know, Cuban people are extraordinary people in many ways, folks. And they're quite entrepreneurial if you give them a chance. And that's beginning to happen with these slowly emerging reforms, which are now increasingly allowing more private market activity and this, that, and the other thing. But they're great people. They have a great healthcare system. The hospitals aren't very good, but the primary care is excellent. In fact, if you want a dental implant, go to Cuba. You can get it for $150. What's the cost of an implant in Boston?
$2,400.
Huh?
Wow.
$2,400.
Tell me who is doing it for $2,400, because I paid about $5,000.
That's with the crown.
Huh? It's with the crown. We go to Denver, Colorado, and visit our daughter, and Kitty can get her implants for $3,000, not $5,000 or $6,000. But I think Cuba would just explode economically. I mean, in the best sense of the word, with a resumption of trade relations with the United States, and there'd be tons of investment down there. You know, the question again is, so what impact does it have on politics? But the Cuban American community these days in the United States is very prosperous. It's got a lot of money. It's prepared to do a fair amount of investing down there, and it's a great place with lots of good people. So isn't it time after 50 years to end this thing? Maybe one last comment, or have you had enough? Yeah.
I appreciate.
Oops, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Excellent. And I understand this business about getting rid of the chemical weapons
Yeah.
in the Middle East there. But
Yeah.
as far as the nuclear weapons
Yeah.
in the Middle East, we're saying let's go to the World Congress and
Yeah.
so forth. If the United States is not obeying what's going on with the Security Council, or various countries not obeying, how do you enforce it so that they can get rid of the nuclear weapons and also the chemical?
Well, the short answer is that if the United States isn't paying attention to these international institutions, then don't be surprised if nobody else does either. I mean, we are, after all, an example. Maybe the example, I don't know. So when we just basically said, we don't care what the International Court of Justice said about what we're doing in Nicaragua, we'll do what we want to do. We don't care what the Security Council says about Iraq, we're going to invade anyway. Isn't that what happened? I mean, when you consistently disregard these kinds of institutions as the United States of America, then why should anyone else? That's why we have got to be an example, folks, in the best sense of the word. But, and it's one of the reasons why I hope we will now get on such a path and essentially do what the UN Charter says, which is that if there's going to be intervention, it's got to be supported by the Security Council. And isn't it amazing that in the case of Iran, there is unanimous support in the Security Council for what have been increasingly tougher and tougher economic sanctions, which are now having a profound effect on Iran and having something to do with its willingness to start talking seriously about being in compliance with international law. And I think that's a good thing. And it has the support of the Chinese and the Russians and everybody else. Isn't that amazing? Same with the chemicals. So I think you look for, as I say, same as, you know, you look for areas of common ground. Hell, if I were in the Senate of the United States and I was proposing significant changes to the National Security Council, and Rand Paul, with whom I agree on nothing when it comes to domestic policy, is having the same, and by the way, so are the American people. What did those polls say? 75, 78% of the American people were opposing military intervention in Syria. Tells me we're all learning from history. Now, some people said, Bill Keller, the former editor of the New York Times, wrote a column which I thought was rather silly, called The New Isolationism. Baloney! Those of us who are against the kind of thing I'm talking about are not isolationists. We're strongly committed internationalists. And we want the United States to strongly and consistently support this kind of international approach to problem solving. We're not isolationists. What's he talking about? How could the son of Greek immigrants be an isolationist? I mean, inconceivable, right? Anyway, I hope this makes some sense to you, but if it doesn't, or if you have some concerns, m.dukakis@neu.edu. Feel free to email me, and I hope those of you responsible for these meetings will continue to have them and encourage people to come and sit and exchange ideas and so forth. In the meantime, let me know if we can get you involved in this arts thing.
Definitely.
And anything else that's local, I'm still up to my eyeballs in most of this stuff. But it's fun, you know, folks. I mean, people say to me every once in a while, well, you know, it must be much better now because you don't have all that pressure. And I say to them, you know, when you're in political office, I say, look, you don't understand guys like us. I mean, I love pressure. I mean, we go into politics because we love pressure. We don't want to sit on the sidelines just gnashing our teeth while people do things that we don't agree with. We want to be in the middle of this thing, trying the best we can to make things happen. So, and even when you leave political office, I don't have to tell you, I mean, so one thing that ought to be on our agenda when it comes to this arts thing is a sit down with the newly elected mayor, whoever that's going to be, and the arts community to start planning now for the first season-long arts festival in the city of Boston. Wouldn't that be great? I think it'd be terrific. Thank you all very much.